Hello, my name is Harleen Perez, and I will be discussing dioxin exposure and trends in the United States. This is my outline of what my discussion will cover. First, I will discuss commercially used dioxins and Agent Orange, then the events of Times Beach contamination and its implications, sources of dioxin release in the United States, sources of human exposure to dioxins, and finally, the global burden of dioxin emissions. The purpose of this presentation is to give a brief history of the events that occurred in Times Beach, Missouri, followed by a discussion of Agent Orange and dioxin release and the local and global trends of dioxin emissions. Times Beach, Missouri was a small town of about 2,240 residents in St. Louis County, Missouri, and was completely evacuated by the United States EPA in the mid 1980s after a flooding revealed high levels of dioxin contamination that made the national headlines. It was the largest civilian exposure to dioxin in the United States in history. It also cost the United States a total of $110 million to clean up the mess. That contamination started due to the lack of funding from the town to control dust on the 23 miles of dirt roads, and so they hired Russell Bliss, a waste hauler, to oil roads beginning in 1971 all the way up to 1976. There are four most common dioxins-like compounds, the most toxic being TCDD, which is also found to be a byproduct of the production of Agent Orange, a highly toxic herbicide that was used during the Vietnam War. Dioxin are highly permanent pollutants, which is why they have a higher half-life and are highly insoluble in water, as shown on this table. Nepaco, the Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company in Benora, Missouri, produced hexachlorophene, which also produced a byproduct of TCDD, and they also produced Agent Orange in the earlier days of the Vietnam War. They subcontracted Russell Bliss to get rid of their waste products, which contain levels of dioxin about 2,000 times higher than the dioxin content in the actual Agent Orange itself. This is the same oil waste that Russell Bliss used to spray the roads in the town of Times Beach, Missouri, and prompted the town evacuation later on when horses began to die from dioxin poisoning. Dioxins are persistent organic pollutants, as demonstrated by this chart. Soil samples from the three experimental sites in Times Beach, Missouri were taken in 1984 and 1988, 4 years apart from each other, and the soil concentration of dioxins were nearly unchanged. About 265,000 tons of contaminated soil and debris from Times Beach and 28 other sites in eastern Missouri were incinerated from 1996 to 1997. This chart highlights the importance of regulating dioxin emissions, since these compounds are highly persistent in our environment once released. Looking at the release of dioxin into the environment in the United States after the Times Beach disaster, dioxin was banned by the EPA and regulated. Total emissions were on a decline from 1987 to 2000, with air emissions of dioxin being the top ranked. Since dioxins are persistent pollutants in our atmosphere and have longer than usual half-lives, it is not surprising that human exposure still occurs, surprisingly, in the food industry. The percentage contributions of dioxins in our daily intake from food we regularly eat is shown on this chart. Vegan food samples are the highest contributors to daily intake of dioxin through ingestion, with dairy, eggs, and meat ranking respectively. The burden of dioxin exposure still affects our daily lives in the United States, despite regulations and despite being a banned pollutant. Globally, as shown on this map, the burden of dioxin emissions is seen primarily to affect our oceans. This highlights the importance of tackling dioxin contamination globally, instead of single-handedly in one region. Specifically, our marine environments may be more impacted by dioxin contamination than we have previously thought. In summary, dioxins are persistent organic pollutants, which take a long time to degrade and have a huge burden on our environment over time. Despite the prompted attention to dioxin regulation and the banning that the Times Beach disaster brought, human exposure and burden still occurs, primarily through the food industry and ingestion. Even though dioxin emissions have declined and continue to decline, back barrel burning is another phenomenon that is on the rise and threatens the steady decline of dioxin emissions. Lastly, we must look at dioxin as a global burden and tackle it uniformly and consider all aspects and regions from our environment with special attention to our marine environment. Thank you. That is all.